this video, we will start to learn what is consumption function. So first of all, you have to understand the consumption function is try to show the relationship between the income and the people's consumption. And King actually is the first guy to find or to demonstrate what is the relationship or mathematical relationship between the income and consumption. So King first noted that consumption is not completely determined by the current income. Some consumption actually is considered to be autonomous. As we discussed before, many of you are very easy to understand why the more disposable income you have, the more consumption you make. And people, because they know they have more income, they don't want to wait to save it and they want to consume it. So the income and consumption always have this kind of positive relationship. The more income you have, the more consumption you will make. However, as I mentioned, King actually find income is not the only reason to affect people's consumption. That's why what we will see here, the consumption function actually will have two components. So the first component is what King proposed, is called the autonomous consumption. That is a consumption that will not affect by your income. And the second component is called income-dependent consumption. So that part of consumption is what we observe that the consumption increase, income increase. And so that part of consumption is related to the income. It is called income-dependent consumption. So first of all, let's understand our autonomous consumption. First, let's formally define what is autonomous consumption. So autonomous consumption, we usually use A to denote it. So this is a consumer spending, not depend on current income. Keep in mind, this is talk about current income. And so people consume even if they have no income, can borrowing or drawing down saving. So now we're going to look at what actually determines on our autonomous consumption. Or another way, why we need to have why people will have autonomous consumptions. So generally speaking, we have 5 different reasons. So 5 potential reasons. So first is called expectation. So people who anticipate a pay raise often increase spending before actual income is received. And people who expect to be laid off tend to save more and spend less. So I don't think this surprises you. I already see so many new graduates, a student who already got job offer before graduate. So one of the interesting thing I observe is once they got offered, they instantly go to the car dealer to buy a car. So what they're doing is they haven't got that income yet, but they already consumed. So that's why that consumption actually is not depend on their current income, because at that point they are still students. They still 3-4 more months away from their being officially hired. So, but their consumption already made. So that is the expectation for the future income can change, can affect the autonomous consumption. And the second factor will affect autonomous consumption is called the wealth effects. So the wealth effects. So that means the amount of the wealth or asset liability an individual owns will affect their consumption. So think about the consumption made by Bill Gates. So we know Bill Gates are billionaire, but he doesn't earn $1 billion every year. So that his wealth worth billions of dollars. So you can think about his expenditure. So you can Google it how much his house worthy and what kind of car he drove. One thing I know for sure, he has a Porsche because that's one of his dreaming car when he was young. So his consumption actually is not attached on his current income, actually is attached on his wealth. Because you can think about for those consumption, and so since he has wealth, eventually if he really run out of cash and he can sell the asset and try to pay the debts, right? So the people's wealth will affect people's consumption. So this part of consumption is not related to their current income. And the third impact is coming from the credits. So the credits is availability of the credit allows people to spend more than their current income. So the need to pay past that may limit the current consumption. So this is really common situation in America. So this credit system using credit cards for shopping, it just started when I left the US, when I left China in 2009. I remember when I got my first credit card, what I did is first of all, my parents gave me 2,000 yuan, which is about at that time the exchange rate is $1 equal to 7 US yuan. So $2,000 yuan equal to about $200, $250. So what happened is I got $2,000. First of all, I put in my bank account and then put in my credit card. Then I start using my credit card to pay the fee for my GRE test and TOEFL test. And then I didn't understand for the credit card I can consume before I put money in. And then later I got a bill saying I had to pay the money. That's how much I consumed. By the end of the circle, I had the zero to pay. I said, yes, of course. I already put money down. Why I need to pay $0? Right? That didn't surprise me. And until later, I realized, wait a second. Actually, I cannot put in the money and using the card. And then when I got their bill, and then I pay the card. So that's really changing my thought. I never thought I can consume without I have put down my money. So you can see the credit system actually allow us to consume without having current income available. So the availability of the credit system definitely will help to increase the consumption. However, as also we decided the opposite scenario that the need to pay past the debt may limit the current consumption. So think about after you graduate, even you find a good job, you dare not to buy a very expensive car, not because your salary is not high enough. It is because you have to pay your student loan. You know that if you don't pay the loan, that actually going to hurt your credit history, and then you will even harder to get a loan in the future. So the priority is finding a job, pay the student loan, and so if you know paying the loan is part of the thing you have to do, and you definitely will reduce your consumption because part of your disposable income going to be used to pay your debt. So this is the third impact going to affect your autonomous consumption. That is the availability of the credits. And so the last impact factor is called the taxes. So the taxes are the gap between the total and disposable income. If income tax goes up, and the disposable income will decline, and the consumer will not be able to buy the goods and the service produced. And so this shouldn't surprise you. Currently, we are doing the opposite thing related to tax. So we have the tax reduction, especially for the corporate tax. So reducing the tax actually will increase your disposable income. And although your current income didn't change, decrease the tax actually increase your disposable income. And everybody know that the disposable income increase, and then you will increase your consumption as well. So this is called autonomous consumption, and you can see none of these factors are related to your current income. So those are the factors are actually will affect your consumption, your daily consumptions, but they are not related to your current income. So this is the first component. So now let's look at second component called income dependent consumption. So we are using B times YD to denote income dependent consumption. So the YD is disposable income, and the B actually is pretty interesting. It is the ratio we learned in the previous video, which is marginal propensity to consume. So marginal propensity to consume, MPC. And so this is the B times YD, income dependent consumption. So in recognition of this many determinant of consumption, Keynes distinguished two kinds of the consumer spending: spending not influenced by the current income, spending that is determined by current income. And so that's why we end up this consumption function. Consumption function equal to C equal to A plus B times YD. So consumption equal to autonomous consumption plus income-dependent consumption. So these various determinants of consumption are summarized in the equation called a consumption function. So this is our consumption function. So to give you to do a summary about our consumption function, keep in mind C is consumption, current consumption. A is our autonomous consumption, and plus marginal propensity to consume, MPC, times disposable income. So this will end up our consumption function. If in the future you will learn quantitative analysis, QUAN340, actually your professor will using the real data to show you this consumption function. So this consumption is not made up. Actually, we can use the real data collected from every consumer in the United States to show the existence of these consumption functions. And so the last I want to add in is for the consumption function, it actually indicates how much consumption will be included in aggregate demand at existing price level and how consumption component of aggregate demand will shift when income changes. And so next we will look at if we try to use in a chart to showing how the consumption function look like and how it should look like. So look at here. So this is our consumption function. So the vertical axis is consumption spending. Horizontal axis is other disposable income. And when we talk about our consumption function, and it will be our blue line. So you can see that the blue line is our consumption function. It's go up, which means the more disposable income you have, the higher consumption you will make. Look at when disposable income goes to zero. So when the disposable income is zero, and on the intersection between this zero vertical line with our consumption function line, we got 50. So the 50 is the value for A, which is the autonomous consumption. In this case, which means without any income, disposable income, so the people already made $15 per week consumptions. And also here it's very interesting that in this chart, we're also introducing this line called the 45-degree line. So this 45-degree line, this green line. So the 45-degree line represents all points where consumption and income are exactly equal. So consumption and income are exactly equal. So the slope of the consumption function equal to the marginal propensity to consume. And the saving is the difference between the 45-degree line and the consumption function. So now I will explain why the distance between the blue line and the green line will give us a value for the saving. So first, think about 45-degree line means. So if you don't know what does that mean, I can give you an example. So let's look at the dot G, the point G here. So the point G you will find the vertical value is 100 and horizontal value is 100. And now look at the point, let's say point E. We can look at this dot. So this dot, there is no number. So at this dot, the consumption is $350, and also our disposable income is $350. So what does this 45-degree line means? So 45-degree line means any point on it, the vertical value equal to the horizontal value. In other words, any point on the 45-degree line means the consumption equal to the disposable income. So now let's think about why the difference between the blue line and the green line is our saving. So the vertical axis, keep in mind the vertical axis for the blue line is the value for the consumption. So the vertical value is the consumption. And however, we know any point on the green line is equal to the vertical value. The vertical value equal to consumption, but also equal to the disposable income. So the difference between the blue and the green line actually is equal to consumption minus our disposable income. This consumption minus disposable income. So look at point B. What does that mean? So point B, our blue line is above our green line. So which means the vertical value for the blue line is higher than the vertical value of the green line. So our consumption is higher than our income. So at this point, we don't have any saving. On the contrary, we may also even borrow the money to buy the. We don't even, our consumption is higher than the income. We even borrow the money to make the consumption happening. However, if you look at the point D on our green line, on our blue line, so point D, at the point D, the The blue line is under our green line. So that means our disposable income is higher than our consumption at this point D. So in this case, the differences is tell us how much money we saved. So how much money we saved. And so after we understand saving, and also at some point we have more consumption than our saving. If that's the case, we will call it this saving. So this saving occur when the consumer use saving to buy things. When we are using the saving to buy things. So that's not a surprise when we are buying a house. Sometimes people will withdraw money from saving to make the purchase. So this is our saving, our consumption function showing on the curve. And so next we will look at when we are having a disposable income change and how that affect our consumption functions. Consumer could reduce autonomous consumption because lost confidence. As we discussed, if you know, for instance, when people work for GE, they saw so many people are laid off, people are worrying, so they may also get a notice 60 they have a notice to telling them they are gonna losing job after 60 days. So those will causing them causing the autonomous consumption decrease. So on the chart, I'm showing you if we have autonomous consumption decrease, what we see is our consumption function will move down. So our consumption will move down from C equal to A1 plus BDYD to C equal to A2 plus BYD. The reason we have this shift is because our autonomous consumption decrease. So this would decrease our consumption, and the reduced consumption would lead to a shift of aggregate demand to the left. So keep in mind, our consumption is 2/3 of of GDP, and which means if our consumption decrease, our AD will decrease too. If aggregate demand decrease, our aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. That's why we see when our consumption function curve move down, and we will see aggregate demand curve shift to the left. So after we know the autonomous consumption change, actually we're shifting our consumption function, which in turn will shift our aggregate demand curve. So this shed a light on what will shift our aggregate demand curve. So anything will affect our autonomous consumption will help to shift our aggregate demand curve. So what actually going to affect autonomous consumption? Actually, we already discussed. So first of all, is our income. So when our income changed, and we will see our consumption function change, which will further affect aggregate demand. And also our expectation for our future income, or we call it consumer confidence. And so that will also change our autonomous consumption and will further change our aggregate demand curve. And also our wealth effect will affect autonomous consumption, which will also affect the aggregate demand curve shifting. And the credit condition, a good credit condition allow us to increase our autonomous consumption, and which will shift our aggregate demand curve to the right. And also for the tax policy, when government have the tax cut, which increase our disposable income, and also will allow us to increase consumption function, which in turn to help to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So those are the 5 determinants will affect our aggregate demand curve. So keep in mind this week discussion, we actually are going to discussing something related to the aggregate demand curve, and you're supposed to look at what will affect our based on the policy, what policy affect which factor we are listing here, so that affect our aggregate demand curve. And so to implement what we learned here to the real world, actually in 2006, 2008, and our home equity fell, so which means the wealth decreases, and people know once they have wealth decreases, that will affect their autonomous consumption. And at the same time, the consumer confidence also failed, and which means they'll further hurting our autonomous consumption. So our consumption function will dramatically move downward, which will further affect our aggregate demand. so decrease our demand when we're causing aggregate demand shift to the left, and which result in our Great Recession in the United States and even in the world. And so shift the aggregate demand can be a cause of the macro instability. And so that is the whole reason we're learning this consumption, looking at the consumption function. The ultimate goal is try to understand what are the determinants to the aggregate demand curve. So why the aggregate demand curve shifting to the right and left, and so how the consumption function affect our aggregate demand curve.